In the marble halls of Astoria Palace, where ancient traditions clash with modern politics, a single moment of violence between royal children will spark a crisis that threatens to topple a 1,000-year-old monarchy. When 17-year-old Prince Marcus strikes his 8-year-old half-sister Princess Elena during a public ceremony, the elite royal guard faces an impossible choice: protect the heir to the throne or defend an innocent child. What happens next will change the kingdom forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across the grand courtyard of Astoria Palace as hundreds of dignitaries gathered for the annual Harvest Festival ceremony. Queen Isabella stood on the ceremonial balcony, her emerald gown catching the light as she surveyed the crowd below. This was more than just tradition. It was a carefully orchestrated display of royal unity at a time when the Kingdom of Astoria faced mounting pressure from neighboring nations and growing unrest among its citizens. Captain Marcus Steele of the Royal Guard adjusted his ceremonial armor and scanned the courtyard with practiced eyes. At 35, he had served the crown for 15 years, rising through the ranks through dedication and an unwavering sense of duty. Today felt different, though he couldn't quite place why. Perhaps it was the tension that had been building in the palace for months, or the way Queen Isabella's second husband, Duke Roderick Blackwood, kept glancing nervously at his pocket watch. The royal family began their procession down the marble steps. Queen Isabella led the way, followed by her son from her first marriage, 17-year-old Prince Marcus Blackwood, now heir apparent after taking his stepfather's name. The prince had grown tall and broad-shouldered, but there was something unsettling about the way his dark eyes surveyed the crowd, as if he were already measuring them as subjects rather than citizens. Behind them walked 8-year-old Princess Elena, the queen's daughter with Duke Roderick. The little princess wore a white dress embroidered with silver threads, her golden hair braided with tiny flowers. She moved with the careful grace that had been drilled into her by years of etiquette lessons, but Captain Steele could see the excitement in her bright blue eyes. This was her first major public ceremony, and she had been looking forward to it for weeks. The ceremony proceeded smoothly at first. Queen Isabella delivered her traditional speech about unity and prosperity, while the crowd applauded politely. Duke Roderick presented the ceremonial harvest crown, a wreath of wheat and precious gems that symbolized the kingdom's agricultural wealth. It was Princess Elena's role to carry this crown to the ceremonial altar, a simple but significant task that marked her official introduction to royal duties. As the little princess stepped forward to receive the crown, Prince Marcus moved closer. Captain Steele noticed the young man's jaw was clenched, his hands balled into fists at his sides. The captain had observed troubling changes in the prince over the past year. The boy had grown increasingly resentful of his young half-sister, particularly as courtiers and citizens seemed charmed by her innocent enthusiasm. There had been whispered reports of the prince's cruel treatment of palace staff, his explosive temper during private lessons, and his growing obsession with what he saw as threats to his position as heir. Princess Elena reached for the ceremonial crown with both hands, her face glowing with pride. The crowd murmured appreciatively at the touching sight of the young princess taking on her first official duty. But as she lifted the crown, her small fingers lost their grip on one side. The ancient artifact tilted precariously, several precious gems scattering across the marble platform with tiny ringing sounds. The princess gasped and immediately bent to gather the fallen gems, her face flushed with embarrassment. "I'm sorry," she whispered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I'm so sorry." It was then that something dark flickered across Prince Marcus's face. Perhaps it was the crowd's sympathetic murmurs, or the way several courtiers rushed to help his little sister, or simply the culmination of months of jealousy and resentment. Whatever the cause, the 17-year-old prince stepped forward and, without warning, struck Princess Elena across the face with the back of his hand. The sound of the blow echoed across the suddenly silent courtyard. The 8-year-old princess stumbled backward, one hand flying to her reddening cheek, tears immediately springing to her eyes. The scattered gems lay forgotten at her feet as she stared up at her half-brother in shock and pain. For a moment, time seemed frozen. The hundreds of witnesses, nobles, foreign dignitaries, members of parliament, and ordinary citizens who had been granted access to the ceremony, stood in stunned silence. Queen Isabella's face went white, while Duke Roderick looked as though he had been physically struck himself. Captain Steele felt his training take over even as his mind reeled from what he had witnessed. His hand instinctively moved to his sword hilt as he stepped forward, placing himself between the prince and princess. Around the courtyard, his fellow guards were similarly moving into protective positions, though none seemed certain of exactly who they were supposed to be protecting. Prince Marcus seemed to realize what he had done only after the blow had landed. His face cycled through several expressions: anger, surprise, defiance, and, finally, a calculating coldness that chilled Captain Steele to the bone. Instead of showing remorse, the young prince straightened his shoulders and glared down at his crying half-sister. "Perhaps now you'll be more careful with items of such importance," he said loudly enough for the crowd to hear. "The crown jewels are not toys for children to play with." The cruelty of the words, spoken to a sobbing 8-year-old who had been trying her best, sent a ripple of horror through the assembled witnesses. Several noble ladies gasped audibly, while foreign ambassadors exchanged meaningful glances that spoke of diplomatic reports that would soon be winging their way to distant capitals. Duke Roderick stepped forward, his face red with fury, but Queen Isabella caught his arm. The Queen's political instincts, honed by decades of rule, were already calculating the damage. A public confrontation between the heir apparent and his stepfather would only make the situation worse. Captain Steele found himself at the center of a crisis that would define his career and possibly the future of the kingdom. The Royal Guard's primary duty was to protect the royal family. But what happened when one member of that family attacked another? His oath bound him to the crown, but his conscience demanded justice for the sobbing child. Princess Elena remained on her knees, gathering the scattered gems with trembling hands while tears streamed down her face. The sight of the little girl trying to complete her duty even after being publicly humiliated and struck broke something inside Captain Steele. He had served the crown faithfully for 15 years, had bled for it, had sacrificed personal relationships and his own future for it. But in this moment, watching an innocent child suffer, he realized that sometimes duty to the crown and duty to what was right were not the same thing. The captain made his decision. Moving with deliberate purpose, he approached Prince Marcus and, in full view of the assembled crowd, placed his hand firmly on the young man's shoulder. "Your Highness," he said in a voice that carried clearly across the silent courtyard, "you will need to come with me." The words sent shockwaves through the crowd. A member of the Royal Guard was effectively placing the heir to the throne under some form of detention, something that had never happened in the 1,000-year history of the kingdom. Prince Marcus's eyes widened in surprise, and then blazed with fury. "Take your hands off me," the prince hissed, his voice low but audible to those nearby. "I am your future king. You serve at my pleasure." Captain Steele's grip remained firm. "I serve the crown, your highness, and the crown includes Princess Elena. My duty is to protect all members of the royal family from harm, regardless of who threatens them." The standoff stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. The entire kingdom seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Queen Isabella stepped forward, her face a mask of composure that barely concealed the storm beneath. "Captain Steele," she said carefully, "perhaps we should move this discussion inside the palace." But the captain shook his head. The damage was already done. Hundreds of people had witnessed the prince's violence and his own response. There was no putting this particular genie back in its bottle. "With respect, your majesty," he replied, "the people of Astoria deserve to see that justice applies equally to all, regardless of rank or title. If this were any other citizen who had struck a child in public, they would be detained immediately." The words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down before the throne itself. Captain Steele had just publicly declared that he would not grant special treatment to the heir apparent, that he valued justice over political convenience. It was either the most noble or most foolish thing he had ever done, and he honestly wasn't sure which. As palace guards began to close in from all sides, unsure whether to support their captain or restrain him, Princess Elena's quiet voice cut through the tension like a bell. "Please don't hurt anyone because of me," she whispered, still clutching the recovered gems. "I just wanted to do a good job." Those simple, heartbreaking words from an 8-year-old child crystallized the moment for everyone present. This wasn't about political maneuvering or succession law or royal protocol. This was about a little girl who had tried her best and been cruelly punished for a simple mistake. Captain Steele looked down at the princess, then back up at Prince Marcus, and tightened his grip on the young man's shoulder. Whatever happened next, he would not allow this child to suffer anymore today. The first chapter of what would become known as the Palace Crisis had begun, and there would be no going back. The tension in the grand courtyard had reached a breaking point. Captain Steele maintained his firm grip on Prince Marcus's shoulder while hundreds of witnesses watched in stunned silence. The heir apparent's face had gone from surprise to fury to something approaching panic as he realized the full implications of what was happening. For the first time in his 17 years of life, someone was holding him accountable for his actions in a way that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. Queen Isabella's mind raced through possible responses, each one carrying catastrophic political consequences. If she supported Captain Steele's unprecedented action, she would be seen as allowing her own son to be publicly humiliated and potentially undermine the entire concept of royal authority. If she ordered the captain to release Prince Marcus, she would be seen as protecting a young man who had just struck a child in front of hundreds of witnesses, including foreign diplomats who would carry the story to every corner of the known world. Duke Roderick had no such political calculations to consider. His daughter stood trembling and tearful at the center of this crisis, and his stepson had been the one to hurt her. His face red with barely contained rage, he stepped forward. "Isabella," he said in a voice that carried more authority than anyone had ever heard him use in public, "if you do not deal with this situation immediately, I will." The Duke's words carried an implicit threat that sent another ripple through the crowd. Duke Roderick Blackwood was not merely the Queen's husband. He was also the commander of the kingdom's eastern military forces and controlled significant territories along Astoria's most important trade routes. If he chose to make this a matter of honor, the consequences could tear the kingdom apart. Prince Marcus seemed to finally grasp the severity of his situation. His earlier arrogance crumbled as he looked around at the sea of disapproving faces. These were not faceless subjects he could intimidate or dismiss. These were nobles, military officers, foreign ambassadors, and influential merchants whose opinions could shape his future reign. The whispers had already begun, and he could see the calculation in their eyes as they reassessed their future allegiances. I didn't mean," the prince began, his voice cracking slightly. But the words died in his throat as he met Captain Steele's steady gaze. The captain had seen enough insincere apologies from entitled nobles to recognize one in its infancy. "Your Highness," Captain Steele said quietly, "if you wish to address Princess Elena, you may do so. But you will do it properly, and you will do it now in front of everyone who witnessed your actions." The challenge was unmistakable. Prince Marcus could attempt to salvage some dignity through a genuine apology, or he could continue to resist and face whatever consequences Captain Steele and the assembled crowd deemed appropriate. The prince's eyes darted around the courtyard, looking for allies, but found only stern faces and disappointed expressions. Princess Elena, still kneeling among the scattered gems, looked up at her half-brother with eyes that held more sadness than anger. At 8 years old, she didn't fully understand the political ramifications of what was happening, but she could feel the weight of everyone's attention and the palpable tension in the air. "Elena," Prince Marcus said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The courtyard was so quiet that even this soft utterance carried to the edges of the crowd. I shouldn't have." He struggled visibly with the words, pride warring with the growing realization of how badly he had miscalculated. Captain Steele's grip tightened slightly on the prince's shoulder, a subtle reminder that half measures would not be acceptable. The captain had crossed too many lines to settle for anything less than complete accountability. "I'm sorry I hit you," Prince Marcus said more clearly, though the words seemed to pain him. "It was wrong of me. You were doing your best, and I was angry about something that wasn't your fault." The apology, while clearly forced, was more than many in the crowd had expected. Princess Elena wiped her tears and nodded solemnly, displaying a grace that made her seem far older than her 8 years. "I forgive you, Marcus," she said simply. "I just don't understand why you're always so angry with me. I try to be a good sister." The innocent words hit harder than any accusation could have. Several nobles looked away, uncomfortable with the child's honesty and the ugly family dynamics it revealed. Prince Marcus flinched as if he'd been physically struck again. But Captain Steele was not finished. An apology, even a public one, was not sufficient consequence for what the entire court had witnessed. The royal guard existed to protect all members of the royal family, and today he had failed in that duty through inaction until the damage was already done. That failure demanded correction. "Your Majesty," Captain Steele said, addressing Queen Isabella directly while maintaining his grip on Prince Marcus, "I formally request that Prince Marcus be placed under palace restriction until the Royal Council can convene to address this matter properly." The request sent gasps through the crowd. Palace restriction was essentially house arrest, used historically for minor royals who had committed serious breaches of protocol or law. It had never been applied to an heir apparent, and certainly never at the public demand of a guard captain. Queen Isabella's composure finally cracked slightly, a muscle in her jaw twitching as she processed this latest escalation. Palace restriction would require a formal investigation, witness testimony, and potentially even a trial-like proceeding before the Royal Council. The scandal would dominate court life for weeks or months, and every detail would leak to foreign courts and domestic political opponents. "Captain Steele," she said carefully, "you are overstepping your authority considerably." "With respect, Your Majesty," the captain replied, "my authority comes from my oath to protect the royal family. Today I failed in that duty, and Princess Elena suffered because of my failure. I cannot and will not allow such a failure to occur again." Duke Roderick stepped forward, placing a protective hand on his daughter's shoulder as she finally rose from where she had been gathering the scattered gems. "The captain is right, Isabella. This cannot be swept aside or handled quietly in private chambers. Too many people witnessed what happened." The Duke's support for Captain Steele's position created an impossible situation for Queen Isabella. If she refused a request for palace restriction, she would appear to be protecting her son at the expense of her daughter and defying both her husband and the captain of her own guard. If she agreed, she would be setting a precedent that could undermine royal authority for generations. Prince Marcus finally found his voice again, though it came out higher and more strained than his usual tone. "You cannot do this to me. I am the heir to the throne of Astoria. I will not be treated like a common criminal." Captain Steele turned to face the prince directly, his weathered face showing no sympathy for the young man's outrage. "Your Highness, you struck a child in public, showed no immediate remorse, and attempted to justify your actions through cruel words. If you were anyone else in this kingdom, you would already be in chains. The fact that you wear a crown does not place you above the most basic standards of human decency." The words were carefully chosen and devastating in their simplicity. Around the courtyard, heads nodded in agreement. Even those who might normally support royal prerogative found it difficult to argue with the captain's logic when applied to violence against a child. Foreign Ambassador Henrik Nordberg of the neighboring Kingdom of Valeria stepped forward from the diplomatic section. As the representative of Astoria's most powerful ally, his words would carry significant weight. "Your Majesty," Ambassador Nordberg said in accented but clear common tongue, "His Majesty King Eric of Valeria has always valued Astoria's commitment to justice and proper conduct. I am certain he would view any irregularities in the handling of this matter with great concern. The diplomatic language was polite, but unmistakable in its implications. Valeria's continued alliance and support could be at risk if Astoria was seen as a kingdom where royal children could commit acts of violence without consequence. Trade agreements, military cooperation, and defensive pacts might all be reconsidered if Prince Marcus was seen as an unfit future partner. Queen Isabella closed her eyes briefly, the weight of the crown feeling heavier than it ever had before. When she opened them, her expression had hardened into the mask of absolute authority that had served her through 2 decades of rule. "Very well," she said in a voice that carried to every corner of the courtyard. "Prince Marcus will be placed under palace restriction pending a full investigation by the Royal Council. Captain Steele, you will be personally responsible for overseeing these restrictions." Prince Marcus's face went white with shock and rage. "Mother, you cannot. I can and I will." Queen Isabella cut him off sharply. "You will conduct yourself with dignity during these proceedings or face additional consequences." Captain Steele finally released his grip on the prince's shoulder, but immediately gestured to 2 of his subordinates. Senior Guards Williams and Torres approached with professional demeanor, but obvious discomfort at the unprecedented situation. "Your Highness," Captain Steele said formally, "you will be escorted to your chambers and will remain there except for meals, formal council proceedings, and 1 hour of supervised exercise per day. You will have no contact with other members of the royal family without express permission from Her Majesty or myself." The terms of the restriction were more severe than many had expected, but given the public nature of the offense and the presence of foreign witnesses, anything less would have seemed insufficient. Prince Marcus looked around desperately for support, but found none. Even the courtiers who had previously competed for his favor now avoided his gaze. As the guard began to escort Prince Marcus toward the palace, Princess Elena spoke up once more. "Wait," she said in her clear child's voice. "Marcus, I meant what I said. I forgive you. I hope when this is over, we could try to be better brother and sister to each other." The 8-year-old's words of forgiveness and hope, spoken to the brother who had just publicly humiliated and struck her, brought tears to many eyes in the crowd. Prince Marcus stopped walking and turned back, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. For a moment, it seemed as though he might say something genuine, something that could begin the long process of healing the wounds that had been opened today. But then his pride reasserted itself, and he turned away without a word, allowing himself to be led into the palace under guard. The crowd began to disperse slowly, their conversations already focusing on the unprecedented events they had witnessed. Foreign diplomats would be drafting urgent reports, nobles would be reassessing their political positions, and common citizens would be telling and retelling the story of the day a guard captain stood up to a prince to protect a little girl. Captain Steele remained in the courtyard as it emptied, his mind already turning to the challenges that lay ahead. He had acted on principle and instinct, but now he would have to defend those actions before the Royal Council, navigate the complex politics of the court, and somehow maintain order while the kingdom's future hung in the balance. The hardest part, he knew, would be the days and weeks to come, when the initial clarity of right and wrong would be clouded by political maneuvering, legal technicalities, and the complex realities of governing a kingdom. But as he watched Princess Elena walk beside her father toward the palace, her small hand trustingly placed in his, Captain Steele felt a quiet certainty that he had made the right choice. The second chapter of the palace crisis had concluded, but the real test of everyone's character was just beginning. The Royal Council chamber had not seen such tension in decades. The ancient oak table, scarred by centuries of heated debates and momentous decisions, now bore the weight of a crisis that threatened the very foundation of Astoria's monarchy. 5 days had passed since the incident in the Grand Courtyard, and the kingdom buzzed with rumors, speculation, and growing unrest. Captain Steele stood at attention before the assembled council, his dress uniform immaculate despite the sleepless nights he had endured since taking the unprecedented step of detaining the heir apparent. The council members sat in their traditional places, their faces grave as they prepared to hear testimony that would determine not only Prince Marcus's fate, but potentially the future of royal authority itself. Lord Chancellor Edmund Fairfax, the kingdom's highest legal authority, called the session to order with a gravity that reflected the historical significance of the moment. At 72, he had served 4 monarchs and witnessed the kingdom through wars, famines, and political upheavals, but never had he been asked to adjudicate a case involving violence between members of the royal family. "We are gathered," Lord Chancellor Fairfax announced in his sonorous voice, "to investigate the events of the Harvest Festival ceremony and determine appropriate consequences for all parties involved. This council operates under the ancient laws of Astoria, which recognize no distinction between royal blood and common birth when addressing matters of justice." Queen Isabella sat at the head of the council table, her face a mask of composure that concealed the turmoil beneath. The past 5 days have been a nightmare of political maneuvering, with various factions at court taking sides and foreign ambassadors sending increasingly pointed dispatches to their home governments. The stability of her 20-year reign hung in the balance of these proceedings. Duke Roderick occupied the seat reserved for the royal consort, his usually mild demeanor replaced by cold determination. Since the incident, he had been fiercely protective of Princess Elena, who had been excused from appearing before the council due to her age, though her written testimony had been submitted and read aloud the previous day. Her simple, honest account of events had left few dry eyes in the chamber. Prince Marcus sat at the defendant's table, flanked by his legal advocate, Master Hugh Blackthorne, one of the kingdom's most skilled barristers. The prince had aged years in 5 days, his youthful arrogance replaced by a hollow-eyed wariness. The reality of his situation had finally penetrated his previous sense of invincibility. "Captain Steele," Lord Chancellor Fairfax continued, "you have made serious accusations against His Highness Prince Marcus and taken extraordinary actions that challenge the traditional authority of the crown. Please present your testimony to this council." Captain Steele stepped forward, his 15 years of military bearing evident in every movement. He had rehearsed this moment countless times in his mind, knowing that his words would echo through history. "Honored members of the council," he began, his voice steady and clear, "I stand before you not as an enemy of the crown, but as its faithful servant. My oath binds me to protect all members of the royal family from harm, regardless of the source of that harm." He paused, his eyes briefly meeting those of Prince Marcus before continuing. "On the morning of the Harvest Festival, I witnessed His Highness Prince Marcus strike Princess Elena without provocation, following her accidental dropping of several gems from the ceremonial crown. The blow was delivered with sufficient force to leave marks on the princess's face and cause her considerable distress." Murmurs rippled through the gallery, where selected nobles and court officials sat as observers. Despite the formal nature of the proceedings, the emotional impact of Captain Steele's plain-spoken account was evident. "More troubling than the physical violence," Captain Steele continued, were His Highness's words immediately following the incident. Rather than showing remorse or concern for his injured sister, he attempted to justify his actions by criticizing an 8-year-old child's performance of her ceremonial duties. Master Blackthorne rose to object. "The captain's characterization of His Highness's motivations represents speculation rather than factual testimony." Lord Chancellor Fairfax nodded. "Sustained. Captain Steele, please limit your testimony to your direct observations." "Of course, my lord," Captain Steele replied smoothly. "I observed Prince Marcus strike Princess Elena, heard his subsequent words to her, and witnessed the princess's distress. Based on these observations, and my sworn duty to protect all members of the royal family, I made the decision to detain His Highness pending this investigation." The formal language could not diminish the power of Captain Steele's testimony. He spoke with the authority of 15 years of faithful service and the credibility of a man who had clearly acted from principle rather than personal gain. Captain, interjected Lord Reginald Ashworth, the council member most sympathetic to traditional royal prerogatives. Do you not recognize the dangerous precedent you have established? If guards may detain royal family members based on their personal judgment, what prevents chaos and the complete breakdown of royal authority? Captain Steele had anticipated this challenge. My lord, the precedent I established was that no member of the royal family, regardless of their position in succession, is above the basic laws that govern civilized conduct. If we allow violence against children to go unchecked simply because of the perpetrator's royal blood, what message does that send to the people of Astoria? The counter-question was skillfully delivered, turning the focus from royal prerogative to moral authority. Several council members nodded thoughtfully, recognizing the strength of Captain Steele's position. Lady Margaret Thornfield, the sole female member of the council and a longtime advocate for legal reform, leaned forward. Captain Steele, in your 15 years of service, have you ever witnessed similar behavior from Prince Marcus toward Princess Elena or other members of the royal household? The question opened a door that Captain Steele had hoped to avoid, but honesty compelled him to walk through it. My lady, there have been incidents. Nothing as public or as severe as what occurred during the ceremony, but there have been reports of concerning behavior. What sort of reports? Lady Thornfield pressed. Captain Steele glanced briefly at Queen Isabella, whose face remained impassive. Verbal confrontations with palace staff, particularly those assigned to Princess Elena's care. Incidents of property destruction during private tutoring sessions. Several occasions where His Highness has had to be physically restrained during arguments with his stepfather. Each revelation landed like a hammer blow, painting a picture of escalating behavioral problems that culminated in public violence. Prince Marcus's face reddened with shame and anger, while Duke Roderick's expression grew increasingly grim. Master Blackthorn rose again. My lords and lady, we must question the propriety of introducing hearsay evidence about alleged private incidents that have no bearing on the specific charges being considered. But Lord Chancellor Fairfax shook his head. The Council has the authority to consider any evidence that speaks to the character and pattern of behavior of the accused. Captain Steele's testimony regarding his observations as head of palace security is admissible. The ruling was a significant victory for those seeking accountability. Queen Isabella's advisors had warned her that the council might limit testimony to the specific incident, which could have made it easier to frame Prince Marcus's actions as an isolated lapse in judgment. Captain Steele, continued Lady Thornfield, what would you have done if any other citizen of Astoria had struck a child in public? The question was direct and devastating in its simplicity. They would have been immediately detained and brought before a magistrate for assault charges, my lady. And if the victim had been a member of the royal family, the consequences would have been even more severe, as assault against a royal person constitutes treason under Astorian law. The legal implications hung heavy in the air. By his own testimony, Prince Marcus had committed an act that would normally result in imprisonment or worse if committed by any other citizen. The only factor preventing such charges was his own royal status, a protection that Captain Steele was arguing should not apply to violence against another royal family member. Duke Roderick requested permission to address the council, which was granted despite the irregular nature of a royal family member testifying in such proceedings. Honored members, the Duke began, his voice tight with controlled emotion. I speak not only as Princess Elena's father, but as a peer of this realm who has sworn the same oaths of loyalty to the crown as any of you. For 5 days, I have watched my 8-year-old daughter struggle with nightmares and fear, not understanding why her brother hurt her or why she feels unsafe in her own home. The personal testimony was heartbreaking and strategically powerful. Duke Roderick was known throughout the court as a mild-mannered man, more interested in his books and estate management than court intrigue. His obvious pain and anger carried weight precisely because they were so uncharacteristic. My daughter asked me yesterday, Duke Roderick continued, if she had done something wrong to make Marcus hate her. An 8-year-old child believes she is somehow responsible for being struck by her 17-year-old brother. This council must ask itself, what kind of kingdom are we if we allow such injustice to go unanswered? Prince Marcus finally found his voice, rising from his seat despite Master Blackthorn's restraining hand. "I have apologized," he declared, his voice cracking with emotion. "I said I was sorry in front of everyone. What more do you want from me?" The outburst was exactly what his legal counsel had tried to prevent. Lord Chancellor Fairfax banged his gavel for order, but the damage was done. Prince Marcus had revealed his continuing inability to understand the full scope of his actions or accept meaningful accountability. "Your Highness," Captain Steele said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the suddenly silent chamber. "An apology extracted under pressure is not the same as genuine remorse. And consequences for our actions are not eliminated by saying we're sorry afterward." The captain's words were respectful in form, but devastating in substance. He had just articulated what many in the room were thinking, that Prince Marcus's apology had been the product of political necessity rather than genuine understanding or regret. Queen Isabella finally spoke, her voice carefully modulated to convey both authority and maternal concern. "Captain Steele, while I appreciate your dedication to protecting my family, I must ask whether you believe your actions have served the best interests of the crown and kingdom. This crisis has created uncertainty about royal authority and provided opportunities for our enemies to question Astoria's stability." It was a shrewd question that forced Captain Steele to address the broader political consequences of his decision. His answer would either justify his actions in terms of long-term royal interests or confirm that he had acted rashly without considering the bigger picture. Captain Steele straightened, meeting the Queen's gaze directly. "Your Majesty, I believe that the authority of the crown ultimately rests on the respect and trust of the people. A monarchy that protects violence against children, even when committed by its own members, forfeits that respect and trust. Short-term political embarrassment is a small price to pay for maintaining the moral authority that legitimizes royal rule." The response was masterful, reframing his actions as protective of royal authority rather than destructive of it. Several council members nodded approvingly, recognizing the wisdom of his long-term perspective. The session continued for several more hours, with testimony from other witnesses and detailed examination of relevant laws and precedents. But the essential parameters of the crisis had been established through the initial testimonies. As the council recessed for deliberation, Captain Steele remained standing at attention, knowing that his fate and that of the royal family would be decided in the next few hours. He had spoken his truth and defended his actions as best he could. Now the future of the kingdom hung in the balance of the ancient chamber's deliberations. The third chapter of the palace crisis had reached its climax, but the resolution remained uncertain as the most powerful people in Astoria wrestled with questions that would echo through generations. The royal council had been deliberating for 6 hours, and tension throughout Astoria Palace had reached unbearable levels. Servants whispered in corridors, nobles paced in their chambers, and foreign diplomats drafted contingency reports to their home governments. The kingdom held its breath, waiting for a decision that would reshape the monarchy for generations. Captain Steele sat in the guard's common room, surrounded by his fellow officers who had maintained respectful silence about his actions while privately grappling with their own loyalties. The Royal Guard had never faced such a crisis of authority, where their captain had effectively challenged the heir apparent and placed duty to justice above traditional royal prerogative. Senior Guard Williams finally broke the silence that had dominated the room for hours. "Sir," he said carefully, "whatever the council decides, you should know that most of us support what you did. A lot of us have children, and seeing that little princess get hurt like that..." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Similar sentiments echoed around the room as other guards nodded their agreement. These were men who had sworn oaths to die protecting the royal family, but they had also signed up to serve a crown that represented justice and honor. Captain Steele had forced them to confront the uncomfortable reality that sometimes those principles could conflict. Meanwhile, In her private chambers, Queen Isabella sat alone with the weight of 20 years of rule pressing down on her shoulders. The decision facing the council was ultimately hers to ratify or reject, and either choice carried catastrophic risks. Support the council's likely condemnation of Prince Marcus, and she would be seen as betraying her own son while setting a precedent that could destabilize royal authority. Reject their judgment, and she would appear to condone violence against children while defying her own appointed advisors. The Queen's thoughts turned to her late first husband, King William, whose death in a hunting accident had thrust her into power when Prince Marcus was only 5 years old. William had been a just ruler, but a distant father, leaving their son with emotional wounds that had only deepened over the years. Isabella's subsequent marriage to Duke Roderick and the birth of Princess Elena had brought joy to her personal life, but had clearly exacerbated Marcus's feelings of abandonment and jealousy. A soft knock interrupted her brooding. "Enter," she called, expecting her private secretary with updates from the council chamber. Instead, Princess Elena appeared in the doorway, her small form dwarfed by the massive oak door. The 8-year-old had been staying in the nursery wing since the incident, carefully shielded from the political storm raging throughout the palace. "Mama," Elena said quietly, "I wanted to talk to you about Marcus." Queen Isabella's heart clenched as she looked at her youngest child. The bruising on Elena's cheek had faded, but the emotional impact remained visible in her cautious movements and the way she had started flinching when people raised their voices. "Come here, darling," the Queen said, opening her arms. Elena ran to her and climbed on her lap, seeking the comfort that only a mother's embrace could provide. "I keep hearing the grown-ups talking about what's going to happen to Marcus," Elena said, her voice muffled against her mother's shoulder. "Everyone sounds so angry and worried. I don't want him to be hurt because of me." The innocent words cut deeper than any political maneuvering or legal argument. Here was the victim of Prince Marcus's violence, worried about the consequences he might face for hurting her. It was a level of compassion that few adults in the palace had shown. "Elena," Queen Isabella said gently, "Marcus hurt you. He needs to understand that what he did was wrong, and there have to be consequences when someone hurts another person." "But he's my brother," Elena replied with the simple logic of childhood. "I love him even though he hurt me. Can't we just make him promise never to do it again?" If only it were that simple, the Queen thought sadly. The political and legal machinery had been set in motion, and the kingdom's future stability depended on how this crisis was resolved. Personal feelings, even the forgiving heart of an 8-year-old, could not override the larger forces at work. "Sometimes, sweetheart," Queen Isabella explained carefully, "love means making sure people face consequences for their actions so they can learn and become better." The council is trying to decide what consequences will help Marcus become the kind of person he should be. Elena nodded solemnly, processing this adult explanation with the gravity that had marked her behavior since the incident. "Will Captain Steele get in trouble? He was trying to protect me." The question highlighted another dimension of the crisis that had kept Queen Isabella awake for 5 nights. Captain Steele had acted with honor and courage, but he had also defied centuries of royal protocol and precedent. If she supported his actions too strongly, it could encourage future challenges to royal authority. If she punished him, it would send a message that protecting vulnerable members of the royal family was less important than maintaining hierarchy. Before the Queen could answer Elena's question, her private secretary appeared in the doorway, his face grave with the weight of momentous news. "Your Majesty," he announced formally, "the Royal Council has reached its decision and requests your immediate presence in the chamber." Queen Isabella kissed Elena's forehead and gently set her daughter aside. "Stay with Nurse Margaret, darling. I'll come see you as soon as I can." The walk to the council chamber felt like a march to the scaffold. Queen Isabella's footsteps echoed through corridors lined with portraits of her predecessors, monarchs who had faced their own crises but never one quite like this. The very foundations of royal authority were about to be tested in ways that none of them had ever imagined. The council chamber buzzed with tense energy as Queen Isabella took her place at the head of the ancient oak table. Lord Chancellor Fairfax rose with the formal dignity that befitted the historical significance of the moment. "Your Majesty," he began in his sonorous voice, "the Royal Council has reached a unanimous decision regarding the charges against His Highness Prince Marcus and the actions taken by Captain Steele." Unanimous. That single word carried enormous implications. Whatever decision they had reached, it commanded the full authority of Astoria's highest legal and advisory body. Regarding His Highness Prince Marcus, Lord Chancellor Fairfax continued, "This council finds that his actions during the Harvest Festival ceremony constituted assault against a member of the royal family and conduct unbecoming of the heir apparent. While we recognize his royal status and his youth, we cannot ignore the severity of publicly striking a child without provocation." Prince Marcus sat rigidly in his chair, his face pale but his eyes blazing with defiance. Master Blackthorne placed a restraining hand on his client's arm, sensing the young man's impulse to interrupt the proceedings. Therefore, the Lord Chancellor announced, "This council recommends that His Highness Prince Marcus be stripped of his ceremonial duties and public responsibilities for a period of 1 year, during which time he will undertake intensive education in ethics, law, and proper conduct. He will also personally compensate the royal treasury for the cost of this investigation and make formal restitution to Princess Elena." The sentence was severe, but not devastating. Prince Marcus would retain his position as heir apparent, but his public role would be dramatically curtailed while he underwent what amounted to intensive behavioral rehabilitation. Furthermore, Lord Chancellor Fairfax continued, "His Highness will issue a formal written apology to Princess Elena, to be published throughout the kingdom, acknowledging his wrongdoing and expressing genuine remorse for his actions." Prince Marcus could no longer contain himself. "I will not be humiliated further," he declared, surging to his feet. "You cannot force me to grovel before the entire kingdom." The outburst confirmed every negative assessment of his character that had been presented during the hearings. Lord Chancellor Fairfax waited for silence before continuing with icy formality. "His Highness's response to this council's recommendations will be noted in the official record," he said dryly. "Regarding Captain Steele, this council finds that his actions, while unprecedented and disruptive to traditional protocol, were justified by his sworn duty to protect all members of the royal family." Captain Steele felt a wave of relief wash over him, though he maintained his military bearing. The council's support legitimized his actions and established important precedent for future situations. However, the Lord Chancellor added, "Captain Steele exceeded his authority in publicly detaining the heir apparent and will receive a formal censure for failure to follow proper chain of command procedures. This censure will remain in his record, but will not affect his current position or advancement opportunities." It was a masterful compromise that supported Captain Steele's moral authority while maintaining some respect for royal protocol. The censure was essentially symbolic, acknowledging that proper procedures had been violated while recognizing that extraordinary circumstances had justified extraordinary actions. Queen Isabella absorbed the council's recommendations with her characteristic composure, but her mind raced through the political implications. The unanimous nature of the decision made it impossible to reject without appearing to defy her own appointed advisors. Yet accepting it meant publicly disciplining her own son and legitimizing challenges to royal authority. "Your Majesty," Lord Chancellor Fairfax concluded, "the Council recognizes that these recommendations require your ratification to take effect. We await your decision." The moment of ultimate choice had arrived. Queen Isabella looked around the chamber, seeing the expectant faces of council members, the defiant glare of her son, the quiet dignity of Captain Steele, and the weight of history itself pressing down on her shoulders. When she spoke, her voice carried the full authority of 2 decades of rule and the wisdom that had guided Astoria through wars, famines, and political upheavals. "The Royal Council's recommendations are ratified in full," she announced. "Prince Marcus will comply with all terms of this decision, and Captain Steele will receive both the censure and the recognition that his actions have earned. Prince Marcus's face crumpled with rage and humiliation, while Captain Steele straightened with quiet pride. The crisis that had begun 5 days ago in the Grand Courtyard had reached its official resolution, though its consequences would echo through the kingdom for years to come. The fourth chapter of the palace crisis had concluded with justice tempered by mercy, but the real test would come in the days and months ahead as everyone involved struggled to rebuild their relationships, and the kingdom worked to restore its stability. The most difficult conversations were yet to come. 3 months had passed since the Royal Council's historic decision, and Astoria Palace had settled into an uneasy new rhythm. The immediate crisis was over, but its aftershocks continued to reshape relationships, politics, and the very nature of royal authority throughout the kingdom. Captain Steele stood at his post outside the throne room, where Queen Isabella was receiving the monthly reports from her provincial governors. The formal censure in his record had become something of a badge of honor among the royal guard and much of the population, who saw it as proof that he had chosen principle over politics when it mattered most. Several foreign courts had even sent discreet inquiries about borrowing his services, recognizing the value of a security chief who would protect royal family members from each other if necessary. The changes in Prince Marcus had been the most dramatic and, frankly, the most surprising. The first weeks of his enforced education program had been marked by sullen resistance and explosive outbursts that echoed through the palace corridors. His tutors, carefully selected scholars, and ethicists brought in from Astoria's finest universities, had struggled to penetrate the wall of entitlement and resentment that surrounded the young prince. The turning point had come during his 3rd week of intensive study, when Professor Margaret Ashford, a renowned expert in moral philosophy, had assigned him to spend a day working anonymously in the palace kitchens. Stripped of his title and fine clothes, Prince Marcus had been forced to take orders from servants he had previously dismissed or intimidated. The experience had been humiliating but transformative, giving him his first real glimpse of how his behavior affected the people around him. Now, as Captain Steele watched through the throne room's partially open doors, he could see a young man who bore little resemblance to the arrogant prince who had struck his sister 3 months ago. Prince Marcus sat attentively during the governmental proceedings, taking careful notes and asking thoughtful questions about administrative challenges facing the kingdom. The change wasn't complete. There were still moments of impatience and flashes of his old entitlement, but the progress was undeniable. The relationship between Prince Marcus and Princess Elena remained the most delicate aspect of the ongoing recovery. The formal written apology that had been published throughout the kingdom had been a masterpiece of genuine remorse, acknowledging not just the specific incident, but the pattern of cruel behavior that had preceded it. Elena had accepted the apology with the same grace that had marked her behavior throughout the crisis, but trust would clearly take much longer to rebuild. Duke Roderick had been instrumental in facilitating the gradual reconciliation between his stepson and daughter. Rather than harboring resentment over the violence against Elena, he had channeled his anger into determination to help Marcus become a better person. The Duke's approach had been firm but supportive, recognizing that Elena's long-term safety and happiness depended partly on her brother's successful rehabilitation. The weekly family dinners that Duke Roderick had instituted were still somewhat awkward affairs, but they had become important symbols of the family's commitment to healing. Elena's natural warmth and forgiveness had slowly begun to thaw the ice that had formed between the siblings, while Prince Marcus's growing self-awareness had made genuine connection possible for the first time in years. Captain Steele's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Senior Guard Williams, who approached with the disciplined precision that marked all Royal Guard communications. "Sir," Williams reported quietly, "Princess Elena has requested to speak with you in the garden. She's with her tutor for afternoon lessons." The request was unusual, but not unprecedented. Princess Elena had formed a strong bond with Captain Steele since the incident, often seeking him out for reassurance or simply to chat about palace life. The 8-year-old seemed to understand that he had risked his career to protect her, and she treated him with a mixture of gratitude and genuine affection that touched his heart. Captain Steele made his way to the palace gardens, where Princess Elena sat at a small table with Miss Catherine Hartwell, her governess. The little girl was working on her letters, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration as she carefully formed each character. The sight reminded Captain Steele of how young she really was, despite the maturity she had shown throughout the crisis. "Captain Steele," Elena exclaimed when she saw him approaching, her face lighting up with genuine joy. "I wanted to show you something special." She held up a piece of paper covered with her careful handwriting, a letter addressed to him in her neat, childish script. "Dear Captain Steele," the letter began, "I wanted to thank you for protecting me when Marcus hurt me. I know you got in trouble for helping me, and that makes me sad, but I'm glad you're still here. You're the bravest person I know, and I hope we can always be friends. Love, Princess Elena." Captain Steele felt his throat tighten as he read the simple, heartfelt words. In all his years of military service and court politics, he had never received a commendation that meant as much to him as this child's letter of gratitude. "Thank you, Your Highness," he said formally, though his voice betrayed his emotion. "This means more to me than you know. Miss Hartwell says I should always thank people who help me," Elena replied with the serious tone she reserved for important matters. "And I wanted you to know that Marcus has been nicer to me lately. He helped me with my arithmetic yesterday, and he didn't get angry when I made mistakes." The update on Prince Marcus's progress was welcome news. Captain Steele had been monitoring the situation carefully, ready to intervene again if necessary, but the reports from servants and tutors suggested that the young man's transformation was genuine rather than performed. "I'm very glad to hear that, Princess," Captain Steele replied. "Your brother is working hard to become a better person, and your forgiveness is helping him more than you know." Elena nodded solemnly, then brightened as another thought occurred to her. "Captain Steele, are you going to stay here forever? I heard some of the grown-ups talking about other kingdoms wanting you to work for them." The question touched on one of the ongoing consequences of the crisis. Captain Steele's reputation as a guard willing to prioritize justice over political convenience had indeed attracted attention from foreign courts, several of which had made discreet overtures about employment opportunities. The offers had been flattering and financially attractive, but he had never seriously considered leaving Astoria. "I'm staying right here, Princess," he assured her. "Astoria is my home, and protecting your family is my calling. Besides," he added with a rare smile, "who else would make sure you don't drop any more ceremonial gems?" Elena giggled at the gentle teasing, showing that she had processed the traumatic incident well enough to find humor in it. Her resilience and emotional intelligence continued to amaze the adults around her. As Captain Steele prepared to return to his duties, Princess Elena caught his sleeve. "Captain," she said quietly, "I know Marcus is sorry for what he did, but I also know you'll protect me if anyone ever tries to hurt me again. That makes me feel safe." The simple statement encapsulated everything Captain Steele had hoped to achieve through his controversial actions. Princess Elena felt safe in her own home, protected not just by protocol and tradition, but by people who would put her welfare above political considerations. Later that evening, Captain Steele was making his final rounds when he encountered Prince Marcus in one of the palace corridors. The young man was returning from his evening tutoring session, his arms full of books on ethics, law, and governance. The sight would have been unimaginable 3 months earlier. "Captain Steele," Prince Marcus said, stopping and inclining his head in a gesture of respect that was entirely genuine. "May I speak with you privately?" Captain Steele nodded, leading the prince to a quiet alcove where they could talk without being overheard. Prince Marcus set down his books and took a deep breath before speaking. "I owe you an apology," the prince began, his voice steady but clearly emotional. "Not just for the incident with Elena, but for everything that led up to it. You saw what I was becoming, and you had the courage to stop me before I became someone truly horrible." The apology was unexpected and moving in its sincerity. Captain Steele had hoped for Prince Marcus's rehabilitation, but hadn't dared expect such complete self-awareness from someone so young. "Your Highness," Captain Steele replied carefully, "my actions weren't meant as punishment, but as protection for Princess Elena, for the crown, and ultimately for you. A future king who would strike a child in public would have destroyed himself and the kingdom." Prince Marcus nodded, understanding the deeper implications of Captain Steele's intervention. "I've been reading about the history of royal families who lost their authority through moral failures. The pattern is always the same: small cruelties that grow into larger injustices until the people lose faith completely." The insight showed how much Prince Marcus had learned during his months of intensive education. He was beginning to understand kingship not as personal privilege, but as public trust that had to be earned and maintained through worthy conduct. "I want you to know," Prince Marcus continued, "that when I become king someday, I'll need advisors who have the courage to tell me when I'm wrong. What you did 3 months ago, that's the kind of loyalty the crown really needs." Captain Steele felt a surge of hope for Astoria's future. The young man standing before him bore little resemblance to the angry, entitled prince who had lashed out at his sister. If Prince Marcus could maintain this trajectory of growth and self-reflection, he might yet become the kind of king Astoria deserved. "Your Highness," Captain Steele said with quiet formality, "it would be my honor to serve you when that day comes, if you'll have me." Prince Marcus smiled, the first genuinely warm expression Captain Steele had seen from him since the crisis began. "I was hoping you'd say that." As the months turned to years, the palace crisis became a defining moment in Astoria's history, studied by scholars and remembered by citizens as the day when justice proved stronger than privilege. Captain Steele continued his service with enhanced authority and respect, while Prince Marcus completed his rehabilitation program with honors that surprised even his most optimistic tutors. Princess Elena grew up with an unshakable sense of security, knowing that she lived in a kingdom where right and wrong mattered more than rank and title. Her relationship with her brother slowly healed and eventually became one of genuine affection and mutual respect. Most importantly, the kingdom itself emerged stronger from the crisis. The precedent established by Captain Steele's actions and the Royal Council's decision sent a clear message that royal authority came with responsibilities as well as privileges. Future generations of royals would grow up knowing that they were accountable to the same moral standards as their subjects. The palace crisis had tested everyone involved: royals, guards, counselors, and citizens alike. In the end, it had proven that sometimes the greatest service to the crown came from those brave enough to stand against it when it went astray. Captain Steele had saved more than one little girl that day in the grand courtyard. He had saved the soul of a future king and the moral foundation of a kingdom. History would remember him not as the guard who defied royal authority, but as the man who helped it find its way back to honor. The fifth and final chapter of the palace crisis had concluded with healing, growth, and hope for the future, exactly as it should be in any story worth telling.